Hi there. Welcome back to Kari's Confessions, a nonprofit exec tells all. I'm Kari Anderson, principal with Insight Consulting. Thanks again for joining me on my podcast today. So today we're going to talk more about nonprofit budgeting, especially as we enter fourth quarter, and why this is such an important link between fundraising and organizational success. So before we jump in, I wanted to make sure you all knew a little bit more about who's talking to you today. I'm a recovering nonprofit executive director. I had the good fortune of serving in the field for about 25 years for 7 nonprofit organizations, large and small. And I'll tell you, budgeting certainly wasn't something that I was familiar with when I first entered the sector. And I'll tell you, I also was not good at it until probably 2/3 of the way through my career as an executive director. The only reason that I became better at it was one, a board mandate. So there's that. And two, I was lucky enough to have a controller at one of my organizations that sat down and trained me, was extremely patient with me in terms of the work that I was doing and not doing to support her. And in turn, that ended up supported me and my fundraising goals as well as my staff's. So 3 things, right, that we're going to go through today. One, what exactly is a budget? And I'll tell you right now, it's not a spreadsheet. So, though we can use that as a tool, a budget's just not numbers on a piece of paper. So what's a budget? 2, the connection between finances and fundraising. It's critical for your organization. And there's research out there that actually shows the more proficient that we as leaders can become with our budgeting and our financial processes, the easier it is to raise money, which I'm sure many of you will be thrilled to hear. And the third thing we're going to work through today is whom all should be involved in your budgeting process. I like to call it a team sport for a reason. Good budgets are not created in a vacuum. So first things first, what is a nonprofit budget? Well, it's a tool that you use to ensure that you've got enough revenue to be able to hit your organizational goals. It's also a tool to make sure that we're tracking for all of our expenses. Based on the size of your organization, your budget may be simple or complex, but it literally is a listing out of how you're planning on spending your money and in what categories each year. I was working with a client the other day and they said, well, we're just kind of winging it. We don't know exactly what we're spending money on. And it turns out they just have never tracked. They don't have software. They're not using QuickBooks. They're using an Excel spreadsheet and also some air charge. And so they're literally just spending what they have in their bank account. And they haven't ever taken the time to actually map out, well, what is it that we actually need to do in order to fulfill our mission? And perhaps are we overspending or underspending in certain areas? Certainly, there are a myriad of templates that you can use as you start to map these pieces out. I would recommend reaching out to your state nonprofit association for specific tools if you're needing them. I'm also happy to share templates with you at the end of the podcast today. So again, basic speak, it's all of the expenses that you have that you need to be able to spend to fulfill a mission for your organization. We like to line up budgets with fund development plans. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So why does good budgeting matter for you? A couple pieces. One, it helps make informed decisions on the organization's priorities. So that could look like take at a timing of taking on new projects, when and if it's appropriate to hire a new staff member, if we need to say no to specific capital endeavors or yes to software and new program initiatives. It's all driven by budget data. So that certainly helps. Budgeting accurately helps you track goals, both short and long term. Budgeting are real numbers, right? Tangible numbers for reporting to the board and keeping donors informed. The client that I had just mentioned was talking to a funder and funding was denied because, again, they couldn't speak articulately to what their budget is. So certainly having a case for support in terms of what your organization's overall budget is for the year and why you need specific budgetary items in certain categories certainly makes a better case for support for those individuals that you're talking to about supporting you. I would also share with you, in terms of why good budgeting matters, it's used as a critical component of strategy. So when we're thinking about impact reporting on programming, certainly fundraising, operational matters for your organization, administration, all parts of a healthy nonprofit organization. And the budget is a critical, I would call it like a capstone of that foundational piece for sure. I would also share that a strong budget helps you to navigate financial decisions in challenging times. So we think about like the last 2 or 3 years. You could also think back to the Great Recession in 2008. When you specifically have a budget, it allows you to make pragmatic decisions when there's heightened emotion. And it's so much easier to make these decisions, even if they're difficult, if you're working on a budget that was developed when there was not emotion involved in the planning. And there's always a solution for the problem if we've got a budget that's legitimate on paper and has been approved. So, what would I share with you in terms of timing and when is it right or when is it wrong to actually create your budget? Well, if you're a new nonprofit, there's no wrong time to create the budget. The sooner, the better. And what I would also make sure that you underscore is the budget is not a static document. You're going to create maybe your first budget, and this will be the first time ever that you and the board have sat down to say, well, what are we spending? What should we be spending? What could we do, right, if we allocated more money to these particular pieces? And you might discover that you were wrong in terms of the amount of money or the need that you had in a particular category. Budgets absolutely can be amended, but we got to start somewhere, right? And I always encourage nonprofits that run on a calendar fiscal year, so that would be January through December, to start now, right? Now meaning beginning fourth quarter, so that you've got adequate time to get through a draft or 2 or 3 if you need to, so that you can have your budget approved by the end of December. I want you to be able to have an approved budget to work off of when you start the new calendar year, the new fiscal year. So for those of you that run a different fiscal year, maybe it's July through June, I'd encourage you to start this process in the spring. It's easier if we actually map out a calendar for planning. So that calendar could look like, oh, I need to have data pulled from this past year in terms of budgetary expenses by this date. I want to set a meeting with a finance committee on this date. I want to have a draft prepared for the board for discussion and review by this date, and make sure the final is ready by this date. Perhaps that's in December. But creating a calendar certainly is helpful. I would also make sure that you remember that budgeting is not done in a vacuum. Budgeting truly is a team sport. So what do I mean by that? Each of you have different size nonprofit organizations. Some of you are brand spanking new, maybe just have the required 3 or 4 board members per your particular state's state law. Others have a much larger and more robust board, perhaps some additional staff. What I would absolutely implore all of you, especially as executive directors, involve your finance committee in this work. If you don't have a finance committee yet, involve your treasurer. This is a great opportunity to have someone else's expertise, eyes and ears on these numbers. You may have to start the draft on your own, but you'll certainly want to share it with them and be able to give feedback and prepare for questions and pushback. This is all part of the process. And as a reminder, the board is ultimately responsible for fiscal oversight for the organization. So that's why it's so important to be able to have them involved in this process with you. I think some really important questions to consider before putting the brakes on things or before saying no or yes, we can't do this or we can do this. Really use those first sessions to be thinking about, what do you want to accomplish this coming year? And again, don't worry about the money yet. Let's be thinking a little bigger. What do you want to accomplish as an organization? What obstacles, if any, might there be ahead of you that we need to consider as a part of the budget? An obstacle could be our rent is going up, or maybe our lease has been ended at our particular location, and then we have to look for a new place for us to be. Maybe we need to be investing further in employee benefits, and while those are certainly joyful obstacles, if you don't have a lot of money right now, right, that could be an obstacle in terms of budgeting. What changes are coming that we've got to plan and budget for? These are all really important pieces to be able to map out, especially in number form. You don't have to be saying no or yes to them yet. It's making sure you're mapping them out to say, well, what if? right? What are all the categories that we should be planning for? You then work on creating a template and an approach that remains consistent throughout your budgeting process. So you're going to use the same form, the same process every time you go through the budgeting process for consistency, and also for you to be able to look back, to be able to see, hey, there are some data trends here, and we should pay attention to that. If you have a different process each year, it's more difficult to be able to stay consistent and look back over time to say, this is why we made these decisions. I would also encourage you to be realistic. Don't assume, right, when estimating funding, revenue sources, and your expenses. Oftentimes when we get into budgeting, we'll be thinking about, oh, well, we received funding from this foundation last year, or we received funding from this family or this corporation on the last two. Don't assume. If you don't have written documentation that those gifts are coming in, especially from larger sources that may have been one-time funds or grants that are restricted, don't assume that you're going to have those in your budget, right? Hope is not a strategy. We want to make sure that you're very, very sure that funds are there if you're budgeting, and or you're putting an asterisk, right, or highlighting areas where you may need to pause or cut if you don't receive that funding source. So there's always a choice and always a consequence. So be mindful of how you're budgeting in that format. I would also say, and we've seen this get better over the last decade or so with nonprofit budgeting, the importance of professional development funds, not only for staff, that's where we've gotten better for sure, but I would encourage you to budget professional development for board members as well. Think about this for a second. Your board members are volunteers. They're not being paid for the work they're doing for your organization. And we're expecting a lot from them, right? We're expecting them to be co-strategists with you in setting the directional course for the organization. We're expecting them to serve as financial oversight czars. We're expecting them to hire, support, and evaluate you as the executive director. We're expecting them to be a fiduciary of funds raised. And we're also expecting that they manage risk for the organization. Well, lots of board members have never served on a board before they join you. And the rest, they may have served on other boards, but certainly a guarantee amongst all of these is that many of them have not received board training, board education, board governance 101. We absolutely owe them the opportunity to level set their expertise and their understanding of what it means to serve as a nonprofit board member. And our job is to budget for that. So there's my soapbox in terms of professional development. After this draft or drafts circulate, right? You may start it, then it goes to finance. You guys have a couple other conversations about this. The budget must go to your full board for discussion and approval. And especially if things have been contentious before, if you've got a bunch of new projects and initiatives that are starting, this is why this process early is so important, because you might take a couple board meetings to actually get this approved by your organization. And it is better to have that time so that board members can ask the questions they need to, rather than rush this process and have it rubber stamped by the board, because then there's no understanding of why we need the money we do and how it's going to be spent by your organization. So the other thing that I would just remind everyone, and again, guilty as charged. Remember, I served in the sector for a long time, and I wasn't the best at this for quite some time. The budget, right, in draft form, once it's approved, it's not a document that gets tucked away. It's a document that you use as a tool to inform finance committee meetings. It absolutely informs board discussions, if not at every board meeting, pretty regularly, right? Big time risk conversations when we're talking about stewarding funds, when we're making sure we're managing risk, right, or serving as financial oversight. That document's got to be at the ready. And especially if you're a growing organization, it probably should be at every board meeting so that you can assess, hey, how are we doing against this? And do we need to make any decisions about pausing spending or increasing fundraising in order to make sure that we're staying in line with the budget for the year? A couple more pieces for you to consider as you are budgeting for this coming year. So there's nothing wrong about a big budget or a small budget. What matters is that it's right for you And I would encourage you to set challenging yet attainable budgets, because that keeps us, I would say, hungry and ready with regard to our fundraising goals. I've got additional resources for you if you would like them. Feel free to visit my website at my email address is kari@insightconsultinggroup.com. Website address is insightconsultinggroup.com, and that's INCITE consultinggroup.com. There's an email and a button there for you to click if you are interested in budget templates or budget dashboards for your organization. I'd be happy to share this with you. In the meantime, please make sure you watch for me on the podcast channels that you subscribe to. Wishing you the best next couple of weeks, and I can't wait to hear about your budget success stories. Take good care.